When 47-year-old Putin walked into the Kremlin, feeling uneasy, even he wasn't sure how long he would last as prime minister. In the past 8 years, the unpopular Yeltsin government had changed prime ministers 8 times. Yet none of these prime ministers managed to pull Russia out of its quagmire, and instead led to a series of disasters, such as the First Chechen War, which caused Russia to lose face. After a series of unexpected events that led Putin to the position of prime minister, Chechnya, which had been quiet for a while, once again gathered its strength, ready to deal a heavy blow to a weakened Russia. Putin knew very well that the success or failure of the operation in Chechnya would directly determine the trajectory of his political future. The First Chechen War in 1994 was a loud slap in the face for Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Chechnya was a former Soviet republic in the Caucasus region, covering an area of only 17,000 square kilometers, with a strong Islamic background. On November 25, 1990, taking advantage of the weakening Soviet Union, the Chechens held the first National Assembly in the capital, Grozny, where they declared the establishment of an independent state, the Nakhchivan Republic. After the August 19, 1991 coup in the Soviet Union, the only former Soviet military leader in Chechnya, Jokhar Dudayev, seized power and declared himself president. In the following years, Chechnya refused to participate in Russia's constitutional drafting and parliamentary elections, did not recognize Russian federal laws, confronted Russian troops on the border, and extended its influence to neighboring Ingushetia and Dagestan. In 1994, Dudayev's regime captured 20 Russian soldiers amid internal fighting among Chechen factions and used this to publicly declare Russian armed intervention in Chechnya as an affront to its sovereignty. At this point, Russia's domestic political and economic situation had begun to stabilize, and President Yeltsin decided to take action to solve the Chechen issue. Initially, Russia's Federal Security Council decided to mass troops on Chechnya's borders to force Dudayev to abandon independence. If Dudayev refused, Russian troops would wipe out the disobedient forces. Yeltsin assembled 3 army groups, over 60,000 troops, near Chechnya, under the command of General Anatoly Kvashnin. On December 9th, after all preparations were complete, Yeltsin didn't wait for a response from Chechnya and directly ordered the military to restore constitutional order in the region. 2 days later, the First Chechen War officially broke out. Russian forces advanced in 5 columns towards Grozny, surrounding the city within 2 weeks. However, the arrogant Russians did not realize that the plan was to retreat into the city and use urban warfare to bleed Russia dry. The Russian forces, accustomed to fighting on the border, used the same tactics with no coordination between units. Russian tanks and armored vehicles, without infantry support, failed to achieve their full potential. Chechen snipers and rocket launchers could emerge from tall buildings just a few dozen meters away. Russian troops, pinned down and unable to move, hoped for reinforcements, unaware that their comrades were also being shot at every step of the way. After suffering heavy casualties, the Russian forces lost their fighting spirit. In places like Staropromyslavsky and Dagestan, Chechen militants even managed to capture 1,000 or 2,000 Russian hostages at a time. The Russian government was under immense social, economic, and political pressure. Yeltsin managed to kill Dudayev, only to find that the Chechens were indifferent to their leader's death. Recognizing that the war was unwinnable, Yeltsin respectfully invited Chechnya's new leader, Yanderbiev, to Moscow and hastily signed a ceasefire agreement. However, for Russia, the Chechen nightmare had just begun. In the same year the First Chechen War ended, the 2 sides signed the Khasavyurt Agreement. At the time, people compared it to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty that the Soviet Union had signed when it hastily withdrew from World War I. The agreement stipulated that the status quo in Chechnya would be maintained, and 5 years later, the Chechen people would decide their own future. This essentially meant that the exhausted Russian government had given up on Chechnya. In early 1997, Chechnya's new president, Aslan Maskhadov, declared the establishment of the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria and began seeking support from political and religious powers in Iran and Azerbaijan. In March 1999, the Russian Interior Ministry representative in Chechnya, General Shpigun, was kidnapped. Later that year, Shamil Basayev led more than 5,000 men to invade Dagestan and continued to carry out terrorist attacks across Russia. The actions of Maskhadov and Basayev constantly tested the limits of the Russian government. However, in their minds, the weak Yeltsin would never dare to confront Chechnya head-on. They believed the outcome of the conflict would once again see Russia making a token resistance before ultimately recognizing Chechen independence. But Basayev overlooked one detail. In the same month he invaded Dagestan, Yeltsin appointed a young new prime minister. This man's name was Vladimir Putin. Just as Chechnya predicted, Russia, as before, gathered tens of thousands of troops and blindly marched south. At first glance, the Russian government seemed to have learned nothing from the First Chechen War, maintaining its rigid, large-scale offensive strategy. However, after mid-September, when Russia launched its large-scale offensive, the Chechen insurgents realized that something had changed. On September 17th, the Chechen militants, who had initially prepared for a decisive battle, did not encounter Russian ground forces, but instead saw bomb-laden bombers descending from the sky. These bombers weren't in a hurry to target the front lines where the Chechen fighters were stationed. Instead, they prioritized destroying Chechen airports, highways, TV stations, and communication centers. Overnight, the Chechen militants became like isolated mountain villagers, losing their mobility and communication capabilities. Immediately after, the Russian artillery unleashed its power, bombarding any threatening targets. By the time Russian tanks and infantry made their final appearance, the remaining Chechen militants had already lost the will to resist. At the same time, Putin's government began to reclaim control of the narrative. At that time, Chechen militants had two main groups of supporters in the world. The first was the West, which hoped to watch Russia collapse amid internal turmoil. The second was Muslim countries like Iran, which sympathized with Chechnya for religious reasons. For the former, Putin invoked the fight against terrorism, leaving them speechless. For the latter, Putin continually emphasized that the Chechen militants were using religion as a cover for terrorist activities that had nothing to do with faith and should not be supported. Caught between these two forces, the Chechen militants found themselves unable to win on the battlefield or receive any aid behind the scenes. From September 1999 to February 2001, when Putin announced the withdrawal of troops, Russia had lost 2,728 soldiers, while around 20,000 Chechen militants had been killed. In March 2000, as the war was nearing its end, Putin made a move that shocked the world. He personally piloted a fighter jet to the battlefield. This bold act not only helped him establish his tough guy image after becoming Yeltsin's successor, but also shattered the last hopes of the Chechen insurgents hiding in the mountains. Although Chechnya had been heavily damaged just like the previous war, the remnants of the Chechen militants, now scattered, still harbored hopes of changing Russian public opinion through terrorist attacks. Putin knew that one victory wouldn't be enough to subdue Chechnya, so he decided to employ both hard and soft tactics to fully resolve the Chechen issue. Putin first chose a localized approach that maintained a certain degree of Chechen autonomy. He supported Akhmat Kadyrov as the leader of Chechnya. The Kadyrov family held great influence in Chechnya, but Putin's choice of Kadyrov was not just due to his political power. In the 1990s, Chechnya's independence movements were heavily influenced by Wahhabism, a foreign branch of Islam. However, the Kadyrov family were heroes of Chechnya's traditional faith. To help Kadyrov gain a firm foothold, Putin allowed Chechnya to control its oil revenues and manage most of its affairs independently. Over time, Chechens realized that what Dudayev and Basayev had failed to achieve, the Russian government had delivered. Gradually, they accepted this new reality. Coincidentally, while Putin was dealing with Chechnya, the September 11 attacks shocked the world, and the US government began advancing its global war on terror. Given that Chechen insurgents had long used terrorist attacks to manipulate public opinion, the West had no choice but to recognize the legitimacy of Russia's war in Chechnya and its governance of the region. This shift in public opinion gave Putin the opportunity to use extreme measures against these terrorists. It was now time for him to make good on his tough words against the terrorists. Not long after, Yandarbiev was assassinated in Qatar. Within 2 years, Chechen separatist leaders like Basayev and Maskadov also met their demise. The Chechen insurgents believed that all these individuals were killed by the Russian government, but the government attributed their deaths to bizarre and humiliating circumstances. For instance, they claimed Yandarbiev died in a car explosion, and Maskadov was killed by an accidental discharge from a bodyguard's firearm. One by one, the names that had once shaken Chenya's situation were erased, and their deaths symbolized the failure of the Chechen insurgents. By April 2009, when the Russian government announced the end of its counterterrorism operations in Chechnya, Akhmat Kadyrov's son, Ramzan Kadyrov, had already spent 2 stable years as Chechnya's president. The Chechen people peacefully accepted this reality. Although terrorist attacks have not completely disappeared from Russia, since Chechnya returned to peace, the world has come to believe that Putin's tough words to the terrorists were not just rhetoric. He was serious about keeping his promises.